Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 95 of Axioms on Trial. Hopefully, Mike can join us in a few minutes here. He was having some issues logging in. So let me know if you guys can hear me okay. I have my air conditioning in the back. I don't know if you guys can hear it. It's disrupting my sound. But we did a sound check a minute ago, and everybody seemed to be okay. So I'm going to bring on Dr. Michael Strauss, and we're going to be talking about whether or not modern science can provide evidence for God, and we'll hear what his perspective is on the matter. And so here we go. Welcome. Thank you for coming on tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. From my understanding, your position is that modern science does provide the ground, a good grounding of evidence for the existence of God, and I'm curious to understand why you believe this and how you've arrived at this conclusion.
Yeah, it might be good to give a little of my background so people know
Yes.
who I am. I'm an experimental particle physicist, so I do research at a laboratory currently, a CERN laboratory near Geneva, Switzerland. I'm a professor at the University of Oklahoma. I've spent most of my career studying the strong nuclear force, how quarks inside the proton interact. And I've spent the last 10 years or so studying the Higgs boson that was discovered in 2012 and looking for other similar particles. Religiously, or if you want to call it that, I am a Christian. So, hey, there's Mike. So, so I have those beliefs. Yeah, I think, whenever you try to determine what is true in science or anything else, you look at the evidence and you ask yourself, what is the best conclusion based on the totality of the evidence? And
Sure.
so my belief in God, and in particular the Christian God, is partially based on scientific evidence, but certainly based on historical evidence and sociological evidence and psychological evidence and things where I see all over. So scientifically, it's not going to be new arguments. Anybody who has discussed this has heard many of the arguments that we make from observing nature that seem to give evidence for God. And I think, I often give talks and I'll mention 4 things. So we'll just briefly throw those out and then we can get into details. But I think the origin of the universe and the Big Bang points to a transcendent cause. I think the fine-tuning of the universe points to some kind of intelligence behind it all. I think that you can make a strong case that the planet Earth is rare, if not unique, and that tends to point to possibly some significance for humans. And then I think the fact that math describes the universe is a strong indication that there is design behind it. And I think those 4 pieces of evidence from science do give objective evidence for some kind of deity. And in particular, certain characteristics of that even point to the Christian God.
Okay, yeah. I'm definitely curious to see the details of these. Just out of my own curiosity, have you always been a Christian?
Yeah, I actually grew up in a Christian family and made a decision to become a Christian when I was young. But I've always been a thinking person and a person that asked questions and a person that required evidence for what I believe. So, during my particular college and graduate school years, and maybe even starting in high school, I, began to ask questions like, why should I believe this? Is there evidence for it? Certain things that, you're taught as a child, like there's a Santa Claus, I no longer believe. Sorry for some of your viewers. And then other things that I was taught as a child, like don't put your hand on a hot stove, I still believe. And so I investigated reasons why I should believe these things I was taught as a child, as an adult. And what I found is that the reasons to me were compelling.
Great. Okay. So you mentioned, I think, four things, right? You mentioned the origin of the universe. You mentioned the uniqueness of Earth. You mentioned the fine tuning. And what was the fourth you said?
The fact that math describes the universe.
Right. Okay. So I don't know what's going on with the Mike's audio. I think you're muted. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry about that, guys, and thank you, Dr. Strauss, for coming on. I'm having some issues with the logging in thing, but I think I've resolved it. So hopefully I can get on screen here in a minute.
Okay, cool. Yeah, keep trying.
So actually, let me interrupt one more thing, because I want to just really tell. I talked to UC before the program, but I want to just say how much I appreciate what you guys are doing. When you contacted me about being on the show, I didn't know anything about your show, and I went and watched a few, and I was really impressed with your civil dialogue about important issues that you don't always agree with. And in today's world, we tend to scream at each other, and when we have difference of opinion, and not listen to each other. So I was really impressed, and I thought this is the kind of thing we need more of, even when we don't agree. I constantly read material from people I disagree with, because the only way I'm going to know what's true is if I look at the best arguments on all sides of an issue to help determine what I think has the preponderance of the evidence in its favor.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I see it the same way. I will admit that there are moments where it's harder for me to maintain that mindset, usually depending on what topic we're talking about. Like as long as it's like a philosophical disagreement, I can. It's easier for me to do that. I think when it gets into the realm of human rights, and where I feel like certain people use their positions to, I think, strip away the rights of other people, it becomes very hard for me to remain civil. And I know that I think even in those cases, maybe it's the most important time to be able to remain civil, because it's only through that kind of dialogue that you can change somebody's mind. But I've noticed as I'm getting older, I'm less patient. And yeah, it's hard, but definitely it's what we're trying to do.
Yes, sometimes you hear the same, for lack of better terminology, tired arguments that are in fact sometimes pretty baseless. And it does get harder and harder to listen to those patiently at times. And particularly about the things you're passionate about. And certainly human rights are something we should all be passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would hold on before we say we don't yell, because I might yell at Cease, just to pick on him a little bit. But, no, I'm kind of the same with Cease. I find myself, I do have to kind of sometimes fight that urge to get pretty upset, and typically for me, it's usually when I try to ask like yes or no questions, and instead of getting a yes or no, I'm getting like some other type of response where like someone put it a good way. It's like, saying like responding with like, well, I had a pizza for lunch. It's like the same thing to just not respond to the direct question. So to me, that kind of, that'll get my frustration going at times if I feel like my interlocutor is just evading or being dishonest. But that's typically not the case. I think especially on the show, typically we haven't had many of those occasions.
I think it's honestly only happened twice in like almost 100 episodes. So
yeah,
well,
exactly.
I'll try to respond yes or no to all your yes or no questions.
No.
Well, I try. Well, so for me, I always I was like, I have no problem with people elucidating on the matter, but to know directly whether or not like the person agrees or doesn't agree, or maybe they just don't know, And in that case, like that's perfectly fine answer as well. But yeah, so I kind of had. I don't know if we want to kind of just cut into part of it. For me, the design argument, whether it be fine tuning or looking at kinds in the world and determining that they're designed like terrestrial objects or something like that. I've never really found the argument to be compelling, and I have a couple reasons why. Maybe I'll just give two right now, and then see kind of what you think, so we can make it more clear and clean. One, I don't really know that there's any explanatory virtue that's being posited in the design hypothesis, because it seems to just kind of bake in the outcome that it wants to get. And what I mean is that when we look at like why the constants are fine-tuned, or why there's purported to be fine-tuned, if we answer the question that there's a God that desires to create a world with agents, with free will, or really any of those notions, we've already baked in that this God has desires not only to create life, but to just create it all. And I don't see any reason or any logical contradiction for some entity that just exists as a mind alone prior to creation, and in fact just never creates. And so the point is, I guess, is that what we're doing is we're actually pointing to very specifically fine-tuned desires that God presumably has in order to answer the fine-tuning problem of the constants. And really all what we end up doing is kicking the can down the road, because in our explanation, we're just kind of baking in God's desires for the theory. And so it's going to be really easy to get the outcome that you want. But that's never seemed very interesting to me. So I guess instead of going into my second one, just kind of get your thoughts on that type of a response.
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally understand it, to be honest. I mean, you went from the apparent fine-tuning of things like constants, that they're in a narrow range that allow for life, to jumping to some kind of motivation behind God's creating. And I'm not sure that those two things are necessarily related. The question is it surprising that the universe we live in is not just hospitable to life, which is the weak anthropic principle, but is hospitable to life in such a narrow range of possibilities? And I think that doesn't have necessarily to do anything with the motivation or even the reason for why that's the case, right? The current conclusion tends to be almost bipolar when we talk about fine-tuning. Either there's a deity or there's a multiverse. Well, there's a third one. The third one is that it's just not fine-tuned. And there are people like Sabine Hossenfelder and Victor Stenger who would just argue it's just not fine-tuned. But if it is fine-tuned or appears fine-tuned, then it's either, a deity or multiverse. And I'm not sure you have to bring in motivations for the deity into that.
So
Unless I misunderstand.
So I'd bring in motivations, because like what we're trying to do is we're trying to explain. So I have issues with the idea that it's fine-tuned, but that's kind of something I would shelve in the first place. Another thing that I'd shelve for a second is that I don't really know why this deity would really require physical constants to be in such a way. I mean, presumably it could just make the mass of a neutrino like what we take the mass of a basketball to be. I don't really see what nomological restrictions it would have, right, to do such, or any logical constraints. I don't see like an entailed contradiction and such. So I don't really know that the idea that like that constants are fine-tuned, or that God serves as an explanation from that point. But to the motivation point, it seems like it does matter, because we're positing an entity with certain intentions and desires, and it just assumes that these desires are specifically tuned in order to create life, right? Where we could just ask the question about the fine tuning for, like, say, black holes or something like that with some byproduct of life. And I don't really know that it's doing anything for the explanation to assume the desires or intentions that also require some fine tuning type of response for that. Because, I mean, why does God have those finely tuned desires to create life, right? It seems to be just kind of like a vicious regress of you're gonna have to posit some designer that designs the fine tunes for God to want to have these specific constants.
Cease, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in real quick because you said that there are basically three options: no fine-tuning, or the multiverse. But I'm not sure that, at least from my perspective, I'm as confident in those being the only options. It seems to me that fine-tuning is essentially kind of like a God of the gaps argument, right? Where it's like, I can get behind the idea that we observe constants in the universe, and that if we were to change those constants, we would be in a different universe. Yeah, I mean, that seems to me almost obvious, right? But there are also other types of apparent emergent fine-tunings that don't have to do with the emergence of life. And why should we think that the observation of constants is a good reason to think that the explanation has to be a mind, as opposed to it being a natural process like anything else we've observed? Like, to me, it seems like the value in explanation has to be more concrete than kind of a post hoc narrative, right? That is the value of science, right? Like that it's doing more than just coming up with just an explanation, but it's also making certain predictions, and the explanatory power goes beyond just the narrative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what I said is, I think there are two conclusions drawn by most people. That would be multiverse or deity. There's certainly many, many more options, because then my mind went to those who deny the fine tuning. There's certainly another option that, and this is kind of what I hear you saying, maybe, that some higher physical principle mandates these, and this is the kind of a theory of everything, that these are not arbitrarily chosen, that the fine tuning is a function of some higher law or something like that, some theory of everything. I mean, the classic book on this, of course, is the cosmological anthropic principle by Baron Tipler. And they have another option. They think the fine tuning requires intelligence. They think humans are the only intelligence in the universe. So humans will one day reach an omega point where we become like God, and we reach back in time through the miracle of quantum mechanics and create the universe for ourselves. That's another option. I mean, there are an infinite number of options, but I think the two that are held by most people who look at this problem, and a great book, if you haven't read it, you really need to read it, is A Fortunate Universe by Luke Barnes and Geraint Lewis. They are Australian astrophysicists. Luke Barnes is a Christian. Geraint Lewis is an atheist or an agnostic, I'm not sure. And their whole book, and they're mathematical astrophysicists, so they run through the parameters of the universe, and they show unambiguously that it's finely tuned. And 2/3 of their book is going through their millions of computer models that point to the fact that this is a very rare universe. And then at the end, the last third of the book is their dialogue about what's the most likely conclusion. Is it a multiverse or is it a deity? And again, those who have thought about this issue most, Paul Davies really kind of comes up with another alternative, that it's somehow mandated by nature. So there are lots of other possibilities.
I think that's where I'm in that school of thought more.
Right. And we don't know. But when you see something that looks designed, it's very legitimate to ask the question, is it designed, or does it just look like it? Francis Crick wrote this about biology, right? About DNA. Who discovered DNA. He said, we have to keep reminding ourselves that it only looks designed, because he had a presupposition that it wasn't. And when you ask me for evidence for God, I don't think it's unreasonable to say something that looks designed, looks finely tuned, looks like a machine well built and crafted, that the best explanation for that is a real designer. That to me is a logical conclusion. Is it the only conclusion? Of course.
I'm confused by the inference though, because like I don't really know like how someone, if you think everything's designed by God, like how would you take an object, any proposition in the world or object in the world, and assess a non-designed object and a designed object?
Sorry, my internet just crashed for a second. I think I'm. Can you
Oh,
guys
you're
hear me?
good. Yeah, you're good. Yeah, because like my concern is like
But you do it all the time,
we could
Mike.
like I'm sorry?
You do it all the time. You can look at Mount Rushmore and know that's designed, and you look at the figure in what is it, in Vermont or Rhode Island that looks like a face,
Sure.
and you can tell it's a natural formation. You do it all the time.
Yeah, but
No,
I get my concern is that makes my concern that makes sense on a naturalist view, right? Because they have natural, like right in their ontology, it's going to be the case that they have natural kinds, and then they have things that humans design. So I can pick up two objects like a rock and like some stone house. I can't really pick up the stone house, but I could point to it. And there's in virtue of the explanation or the theory that's given, it is intelligible to point out a non-designed or designed object. But the theist seemingly thinks God created everything. So I don't really know like how you would take something that isn't designed to prop up an argument, right? It seems like you would be seemingly having these two objects to distinguish from and have like some asymmetry, but that wouldn't exist in your worldview, right? Because it would just be that God designed everything.
No, of course it does, because again, I can imagine a universe where the parameters for life are broad. That would look less designed. It would look more random, and yet we don't live in that kind of universe.
I agree with you.
One more thing. So, Mike, I'm not sure that your statement would be able to explain Francis Crick's statement then, that we have to keep reminding ourselves it looks designed, but it's not. I mean, that's just the opposite. It's the non-believer in God trying to say that I have a presupposition that I must hold to regardless of the evidence.
So, real quick.
Sorry, you go ahead, Cease.
So I can actually get behind what you're saying as far as like it seems intuitive, right? That something might be designed. I think one of the important kind of points that or lessons that I think modern science teaches us, and I think that philosophy especially teaches us, is that often our intuitions actually fail to capture the real depths of the way nature actually works. And so I can understand that, yes, things may appear designed, they may appear fine-tuned, but the question is, when we observe the way nature works on a deeper level, what do we find? And
we find more fine-tuning. No, we find more fine-tuning.
Well, it's strange to me because I don't share this intuition. So that's why it's strange to me to like prop up intuition about, right? It's kind of like a moral realist telling me they intuit moral facts. Like I don't at all.
I didn't use the word intuition. I didn't use the word intuition. What I said is if it looks designed and fine-tuned, it's reasonable to assume that there is a real designer behind it. That's not an intuition at all. It's an inference based on the evidence.
So yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm challenging. I'm challenging the inference because I don't know how you even have this asymmetry between the two objects, right? Like if I'm making some inference, and I think in my theory is that these are just whether indeterminate or determinate natural kinds, and then I go and design something because I can design things with intentionality. I have everything in my theory there. I have an intentional state and I have natural kinds to design those things, and I can actually adjudicate what a natural kind is in my worldview versus something that's designed by an being with intentional states. But on the case for the theist, they're making an inference, assuming that they have access to non-designed things to allow that type of adjudication. But I don't see that, right? Like that seems to just skip over an important, crucial element, which is how you adjudicate a non-designed thing from a designed thing. And in this worldview,
So
everything is designed.
what I hear you saying is that you would fall in the camp that says it's not designed. It doesn't look designed. And again,
Well, yeah.
there are those into that camp. The people who study this most, scientists particularly, would not fall into that camp. And if we're going to talk about science, then let's go with what most scientists, both atheists and theists, would say. Most scientists will say it looks designed. Now, you don't have to fall into that camp.
Yeah,
but again,
I guess I'm just not really worried about like what most people think. I'm really more cared about like the actual like whether or not this has
neither
explanatory.
am I, but
it just seems like it has some explanatory vices that I personally wouldn't want in my metaphysics, right? Like I don't know, like there's two things here that I feel like at least that I would have an issue with, which I presumably I know you don't agree with, but one is that we're assuming that we're assuming the intentions of this God, its desires, and it's going to be a brute contingency, right? Whether or not we claim it's necessary, or God's intentions here are necessary, like what's going to happen on both theories is we're going to point out two brute contingencies from the naturalist view, if we agree with fine tuning, or the theist. But you have posited one more entity than I have, right? So like I'm okay with a brute contingency in virtue of not adding more entities that I think are unnecessary. So that would be like one thing. And then the other is like the other vice that I see is that there doesn't seem to be a mechanism to determine non-design and design things just in virtue of what your theory posits to begin with, which is that everything is designed.
There are mechanisms. I mean, William Dembski, who is a theist, has a very mathematical mechanism to determine whether something appears designed or not. There are mechanisms. And again, you do it all the time when you look at things. Now, you want to claim that's only because you have other knowledge of how humans build, but it doesn't have to be humans. There are people who think they see design on structures on the moon, which were certainly not made by humans. They were made by an intelligence. So again, I don't agree. And let me just flip around. So I think what I hear you're saying is that the design's not real. But what my statement is if we see design and fine tuning, it's reasonable to assume there's a designer behind it. I don't think anybody would say that the contrary statement has any validity. If we see design and fine tuning, then it's not reasonable to assume that there's a designer behind it. That's absurd.
Well, I'm sorry. I keep cutting you off. I just wanted one last sentence, and I'll mute because this is a little bit important. The whole idea of like the inference, or when I make that inference, I have a set of data that like I'm building the inference off of, where I have non-designed things that I can infer to design things through some past experience. It didn't just like come to me. I had to actually like have some a posteriori identification, right? It's not like a priori or anything, right? I had to actually go out in the world, have some synthetic analysis of the world, and then determine through some a posteriori or empirical identification what a natural kind is, or what it's like to build a house or something. Now that makes sense on the naturalist worldview, which I don't really claim necessarily to be like a naturalist, but it makes sense on the naturalist worldview because they're like the inference follows from the past data of non-designed things to humans with intentional states that create. But I don't see how that inference follows unless you kind of just beg the question about design.
Well,
like you just assume
it doesn't really make sense because, the famous atheist argument was if God wanted to show himself, he could write in the stars, God exists. And what you are saying, if you take what you're saying to a logical conclusion, you have no past experience where the stars could ever spell that out so that if you saw it, you still wouldn't believe. So what you're saying,
well, I would believe it happened. I just wouldn't believe that it infers the designer. It could be like a god. I mean, an alien or something.
Yeah, I believe what you're saying is logically indefensible, but you can hold to it.
So
well, then what would the contradiction be?
Again, I said it. You could live in a universe where the parameters are really broad, that it would be easy, that we would have a theory that, that's even problematic, but that it doesn't appear fine-tuned. I mean, another atheist example that is if an atheist ever tells me this, I know they don't think very deeply. It's the puddle analogy. You know, that the puddle looks up and says, "Oh, this puddle looks like it was made
Douglas
just
Adams.
for me." Yeah, well, and I hear it all the time from atheists. But if the puddle had any ability, they would be able to analyze the situation and realize that they fit in any shaped object, and they would realize it's not designed. But we can do that. We have the ability to run computer programs to see, can we work in any environment? And the answer is no, it's a very, very small one. And so if we lived in a puddle universe, you could argue there's no design, but we don't. We live in a very tightly, weirdly designed and highly tuned universe. And so, yeah, I can easily think of a case where I would live in a universe that doesn't look designed.
Okay, so I want to try to address this part of the argument from my perspective, because I think I might be a little bit coming from a different place than Mike. I don't disagree that it might seem reasonable. Like we see something that's complex, and it seems reasonable to assume design. However, like I was saying earlier, I think I fundamentally disagree that the closer we look, the more sense it makes to hold that position. I don't think that's true. And here's why. One, it's obviously, I'm sure you've heard of it, the watchmaker fallacy, right? The fact that some things might have a shared characteristic doesn't mean that they share all characteristics. So the analogy goes something like this. The universe is complex and a watch is complex. The watch was made in the 17th century, therefore the universe was made in the 17th century. Like, it doesn't make sense, right? I don't see the necessary connection between complexity and design, because I think, from my understanding, again, I'm a philosopher, I'm not a scientist, but from my understanding of the field, there is nothing about complexity that requires the assumption or the conclusion of design for it to be a thing that could be observable in the universe. There are other explanations that may be less intuitive, may be not as accessible, perhaps, but that I think have and hold more explanatory power than the theistic perspective. And when I look at the universe and I see that, as far as we know, the universe is heading into destruction, that most places in the universe are too hot or too cold to have life, that the life that it has is constantly in turmoil. We have diseases, we have cancers. I mean, yes, that if we were to change the constants, we would live in a different universe. Now, does that universe mean that it couldn't have life? I'm not sure that's the case. And Sean Carroll is one of the physicists that makes this point. He says, yes, we would live in a different universe, but not necessarily one without life, just one with a different kind of life. But even if we were to grant, maybe there wouldn't be life, I don't think that an unlikely event suggests that the best explanation is a God, because I can ask the same thing about that. Like, why is God tuned the way that he is? Why does God need any kind of constants in the first place? Like, did God always exist in reality, or is reality secondary to God? Is there any need for a physical aspect to reality if God is this non-physical being? I don't see the theistic perspective as the best explanation. I'm sorry, I know I threw a lot at you there, but I just wanted to put all.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. There's a lot there. Your show's usually an hour and a half. We could go 10 hours on all these questions. And sure. Again, a lot of what you throw out are not scientific evidence for God. They are tough questions. They're questions about the nature of humanity and the evil and suffering we see in the world and the nature of God. And again, one of the reasons I ultimately fall in a Christian worldview is that, I sat on juries before, and in a jury, there's never a single piece of evidence that lets the jury know whether you think the defendant is guilty or innocent. It's a building up of evidence. And one of the reasons I hold to the Christian worldview is this building up of evidence. Does it answer every question perfectly? No. But I think when I ask the tough questions in life, why is there evil and suffering? Why is the universe like it is? How do I explain aspects of science? How do I explain aspects of history? How do I explain aspects of sociology? Is that, to me, the Christian worldview as a whole answers all the big questions in the most coherent and cohesive way. It's a preponderance of the evidence. So am I going to give you one thing that's the silver bullet that says, oh, you've just destroyed everything? No, of course not. That's not the way truth works.
Sure. And to be clear, that's not my expectation. What you just said is actually interesting, because I feel like I approach questions of truth exactly the same way, but my conclusion is entirely different. So I don't expect there to be one piece of evidence. It's like you said, a collective. And on my journey, how I've understood the evidences that I found, looking at science, looking at why there is evil, looking at the way in which things appear to work, the collective evidence for me has brought me to the entirely opposing side as you, where I don't think that Christianity succeeds in answering those questions the way that.
This is why it'd be great to have dialogue about all these things. So again, when you talk, I think it'd be worth kind of wrapping up, fine tuning, and maybe moving some of the other things. But again, I didn't use the word complexity. What I said is that there are many things in the universe. And by the way, many of these constants in the universe, it's not that you just don't have a universe inhospitable to life. You don't have a universe, period. If the matter density is off by a factor of 10 to the minus 60th right after the Big Bang, you don't have a universe, period. If the neutron mass is a little bit higher, you don't have anything in the universe. I mean, there's just, it's not just life.
I have an issue with that, because like that I don't know, and we've had talks on this on the show with a couple of people as well. My view there, and maybe you have some objection to it, but when you like say the mass of a neutrino or something, and it's like in kilograms, like it makes sense to be like, if it's off by like, X% or whatever, that it's going to, the universe like, collapses in on itself, or whatever the outcome can be. There can't be life. But it seemingly it's like saying, if we measured LeBron James in like light years, and we did like a 5% difference or a 1% difference, then he wouldn't be able to play in the NBA. And like, of course that's true, because in one case he's like a 70-foot giant, and then the other case he's like 3 inches tall. But if we had actually measured him in a more precise increment, like inches, and we said, well, he's going to be, he has a 5% difference in height, I'm going to argue that not only is he going to play in the NBA, he's still going to be probably the best basketball player around. And so it seems weird to use the levels of measurement that we use currently to determine that would be the case, also in conjunction with the fact that we don't have another universe to compare to, right? We're using these things in virtue of our universe. We're not using these in virtue of other universes. So seemingly there's two problems there.
So the constants we deal with are not measured in SI units. They are either measured as fractional differences, like as you said, if we were to change this height by 5%, or they're measured as ratios. So if you're going to talk about kilograms or something, that's irrelevant. I agree with you. And then the other issue you brought up, a one universe, that is another issue. This is one of the arguments against, particularly for those who say the universe isn't fine-tuned, like Sabine Hassenfelder. You only have a set of one, and what conclusions can you draw from a set of one? And again, we can talk about that. I have good answers to that, or things that I think are reasonable. I wonder if we should talk about any of the other arguments or evidences that I brought up.
Yeah. We don't have to spend all this time on one thing.
Like, in my room, I have this little picture of a horse in the back, and you can kind of see it appear every once in a while. It's a painting my grandfather made. So that's kind of cool. Okay. So every once in a while, since I don't have a green screen, you see that thing. All right.
Yeah. So maybe we go into. Oh yeah, you go ahead, Cease. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, yeah, let's. I think we both stated where our position on the fine tuning. So we can move on to the other things you put on the table. The one you mentioned that I find particularly interesting because of my interest in philosophy of language is what you said about math. Could you elaborate on that concept for the audience?
Yeah. So again, like an engineer would write out equations that describe whether airplane wing is going to stand the stresses on it, the universe is described by math. I once gave a talk at the University of Nebraska on scientific evidence for God, and I mentioned the first three that I mentioned before: the origin of the universe, the design, and the uniqueness of planet Earth. And a physicist came up to me and he said, "You didn't mention the most important evidence for a deity." And he said that the universe is described by math. And so this other physicist felt that that was the most important because, again, it shows some kind of mind and design. Physicists won't say they understand anything about the universe till they can write a mathematical equation. I had a professor at UCLA who said the goal of physics is to predict the future. And what he meant by that is we understand the physical laws well enough that I can write an equation about what should happen. I can do the experiment and I get that. And again,
what is the
looks
connection?
like
what is the connection between math and there being an intelligence behind the math? Like when I think of math, I think of a kind of language, but what does it have to do with there being any kind of intelligence there?
Does language point to intelligence?
I think that we use language to try to make sense of the world, but I don't think the language itself is in any way, like I don't think that language itself is the nature of the world. I think language is a tool that we use to try to make sense of it.
That wasn't my question. My question was, is language an indication of intelligence? In fact, it's language and the abstract thought that language provides that is one of the few things that separates humans from the other animals. The fact that it's not just language, it's the abstract nature of language that allows you to postulate ideas that are only in the abstract. And this is something that is only found in human intelligence.
So a couple of things there. Oh, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Oh, I just was, because like we're leaving out a party like the Platonists or something that don't believe in God, that will invoke mathematics in an entirely different way, right? That's not going to require intelligence, right? It's just going to require this type of like abstracta. So I don't really see the connection there. I mean, I'm a nominalist, but the Platonists surely would have something to say. And then myself, I don't like just the fact that I can construct language to describe the world doesn't mean that there's the inherent property of the thing that I constructed within the world, right? That inference doesn't follow.
I think there's a real disconnect from my perspective between language, like the tool we use to describe the thing, and the thing itself. I know that and I know that maybe I'm in a minority there, certainly in the context of science, right? But I'm not convinced that the language and the maths or in mathematics are nature itself. I think they're descriptions of nature. So yes, it points to intelligence if I'm somebody using language, because I would need to have intelligence to use the language. But to then from there on to say that therefore language itself is inherent in the universe or in reality is where I'm not quite following how you make the leap.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I even again, I think this is some disconnect, maybe, and I don't want to sound condescending, between the philosopher and the scientist who uses math as the language of the universe to describe the universe. I mean, the fact that the universe can be described by mathematics, again, now I will use the word inference, is an inference that there is something behind it all.
So if I say,
yeah, I'm confused like how that inference works, because it sounds like we can say that that's an inference, but like I don't see that following, because if it's just the case that I construct some language like grunts or math, like whatever, or it's in this case math, if we'll stick to the topic, whether it's universal or not, I don't know that that adds anything to like the inference of like of a designer, because one, a Platonist makes inferences from mathematics on abstracta, so they clearly take a different type of inference where God doesn't follow, unless they're like a divine conceptualist. But even then,
let me quote. So let
go
me
ahead.
quote from Eugene Wigner, who was a mathematical physicist who wrote in his book, in his paper, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and the Natural Science, writes this: the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. We should be grateful for it and hope that it will remain valid in future research, and that it will extend for better or for worse to our pleasure, even though perhaps also to our bafflement, to wide branches of learning. So that's the way that physicists look at mathematics. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language for the formulation of the laws of physics is a gift we neither understand nor deserve. Now, can I convey that in a way?
Craig say that a good bit on there's a debate. Sorry to interrupt, but he has a debate with Graham Oppie, and he like kind of starts with that, but it seems weird because now you have to say, like, when Newtonian physics doesn't accurately describe the universe, it's just application for us, and it does great wonders. Are we saying that there's this beauty in math that it perfectly describes the universe? Because we don't have that. That doesn't exist. We have flaws in everything, and they break down. So I guess there needs to be a distinction that's made. Is it just the applicability of mathematics to the universe, or is it that like it's a one-to-one type of correspondence? Because we don't seemingly have that example outside of describing certain objects.
Let's be careful when we talk about things like Newtonian physics, right? Newtonian physics is a special case of more fundamental physics. It's not that it breaks down, it's that an approximation. If I have an infinite series and I cut off the series after 10 terms, it's not that, those 10 terms don't work. It's that I know it's an approximation to a more complete theory. So again, I don't know how much more I can answer the question. I am reading some of the stuff in the chat. So
I was just more so wondering if like that distinction, like if the force of the type of conclusion you're coming from is more like about the application, not necessarily like having had everything perfectly mapped to some mathematical description. Because it seems like you're going with the applicability of it.
Well, not just the applicability. Let's argue by analogy. But when an engineer wants to design something, they do the math first. They write out the equations that are going to describe the object they build. And the equations describe the universe, the object that is built or somehow came into existence. And so by the analogy is a good way, I think, of trying to explain how I look at math in relationship to a designer behind it all. But you can go like what you said before. Well, I understand that analogy because it's what I'm familiar with. It's human. Can't apply it to God. But again, I would say if we see that in our realm of intelligence, is it unreasonable to apply it to a higher intelligence?
No, and
I don't think it's unreasonable. I just don't think the inference follows, because it follows for other conclusions, like a Platonist conclusion or something. Like there's no contradiction in me if I'm a naturalist just saying math perfectly describes the universe and there's no God, unless someone can show like some contradiction in that view.
Well, of course.
It seems like all we're left with is which theory generates the best novel predictions, and in that case God does not generate novel predictions from my view, unless maybe we do some type of like prophecy or something like that.
Before we get to that point though, because obviously Mike, I agree with you, but before we get to that, which I think is a fundamental difference in the theist versus non-theist worldview, and something that I do think the theist worldview lacks, I do want to address what you just said about language, because you said something that I actually agree with, which is there is a fundamental disconnect between the way that physicists understand language and its application, and the way that I think philosophers understand language and its application. I'm a much less secure in the role of language and its success in capturing the way that things actually are. I think it's far more ambiguous than that. And that's not to say that, you could make any kind of measurements be whatever you want them to be. Like, I understand that physics and math is a very precise thing. But it still seems to me that it's not the language that gives rise to the reality. The language is a secondary description that we apply that to that reality. And as such, all we're observing is that there are certain mechanisms that we can express in certain ways. And I see no problem with that. Why that should lead to God being the more reasonable explanation for that being the case, I ran into the same problem that I ran before with fine-tuning. It's where it's not that it's unreasonable to think it could be, is that I think that the other explanations explain those questions better. And now you mentioned math. You said 4. What was the other one you said? The other reasons. You said.
Well, we haven't talked about the uniqueness of the Earth or the origin of the universe. Those would be the other 2.
Okay, so
yeah, maybe yeah, Strauss. I don't know, or Dr. Strauss. I don't know if maybe you want to respond to that part before because if you want to remember what it was, Cease, then we can respond to that. I want to make sure we let him address some of those objections.
I mean, again, the saying often attributed to Einstein, I don't even know if he really said it, was something like, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And again, why is it comprehensible? Because there is math that describes it. And so it's remarkable to Einstein that we can describe the universe by math. It's remarkable to Wigner that we can describe the universe by math. And those are 2 of the most brilliant scientists who have lived. So you guys don't have to think it's remarkable that we could describe the universe by math. Scientists do.
I do think I think it's amazing. I think it's beautiful. I just don't know that entails a God.
Well, again, I'm going to build, if we had 10 hours, I would keep building a case. I would say we build a case from fine tuning. Is it cut and dry? No. Is it reasonable to postulate a designer when the universe looks designed? Is it reasonable to postulate a designer when any other minute changes would lead to no universe or universe inhospitable life? I'd say yes. Then I'd build another case. Is it reasonable to postulate an intelligent designer behind it all because math describes it and scientists are amazed that math describes it? Yes. So now you're building a case, and then you go to the next point, and the next point, and the next point, and the next point.
Yeah, I feel like though that it's reasonable for me to think that when I had a bad day today, that it was due to bad day fairies, and I can construct a hypothesis post hoc by doing that.
Again, that's a Richard Dawkins. No thinking person says that.
No, but no. I guess my point is that it's I'm not trying to be insulting. It's just that my
no thinking.
No. Listen, I'm not trying to be insulting. Yeah, no, I'm not trying to be insulting. It's just that it's easy.
Let's have real dialogue about real things.
This is a real. Yeah. So this is actually a real position I take. So if it's the case that because evidence is going to be extremely easy to come by in virtue of a theory that you posit, right? I mean, just think of any situation where you could post hoc assess what actually happened, right? Like it rained outside. I could say that it was actually just some kid who went around with a super soaker and sprayed the whole neighborhood down. And it wouldn't be reasonable for me to think that, right? In those cases. And I can grant that there's cases that it's not going to be reasonable, but that's kind of precisely the issue, is that there's nothing generating that expectation that it was a kid with a super soaker. And in the same sense, there's nothing generating this expectation that there is the God. It's seemingly just an assertion. And I don't see anything asymmetrical about the 2 cases, in the case that it's it could be it can be reasonable in certain cases, but the cumulative case doesn't seem to be very reasonable given
there's so
all
much
the constituent
asymmetry.
parts.
So you now have to build up a cumulative case from many different avenue disciplines that there's this kid with a soaker. That's not going to happen. And nobody believes in fairies. Again, there's certain. I've talked to enough.
I know people that believe in fairies. I have pagan friends that believe in all sorts of stuff.
So this is where, Cease and I were talking about the things that push your button. There are so many bad arguments against God, the puddle argument and the fairy argument, that nobody really thinking would hold to. And you hear them over and over again. Thinking people who have looked at the evidence, I mean, really bright people over centuries come to the God conclusion. And from all walks of life and all disciplines, you won't find that when it comes to leprechauns or fairies. I mean, really. So you have to deal with the reality.
But that's just an ad populum. That's just an ad populum fallacy. It doesn't really matter what other agents. But I mean, it's a textbook ad populum fallacy, because like just the fact that all people come to this conclusion, like that so most people think they're moral facts, right? I would never ever grant that like that adds any credibility to like moral realism. Of course it doesn't.
Your statement would be true if I couldn't back it up with all the reasons why.
So real quick, I just want to, because I want to just what you just said, I think it's important about the cumulative case. The problem is that from my perspective, every piece of evidence that you are bringing to the table, from my perspective, the conclusions don't follow. It's not that it's impossible or that it's unreasonable as a matter of principle. It's that doesn't seem to me to be the best explanation. So if I can show the flaws in each piece of evidence, then do you actually have a cumulative case there, or is it just, are there holes on every side of the argument? Like I find, for example, language. I find language to be incredibly fascinating and amazing, and I'm often at awe at the universe, at the way that it seems to function, at the patterns we observe, at how language relates to all these things. So I share the awe that even a theist might have when looking at the world. What I don't share is this move that then, therefore, it's reasonable that to explain those things, God is the best explanation. That's where we kind of diverge.
So what is your best explanation? Let's just go back to the fine tuning. In one sentence, what's your best explanation?
That I think I'm not convinced that the constants, how would I say this? That all I have an experience of is the natural world and natural explanations. And so to me, and I'm sorry it's not like a one-word answer, but I don't know how to condense it. It seems to me that using God as the explanation for fine-tuning is essentially a God of the gaps argument.
So you didn't answer my question. What is your best explanation for the fine-tuning?
Yes, you don't. I would just say you don't need an answer. That's the kind of thing
I would say my answer
that bothers me, that like someone should have an answer, because like the whole point is that like if you don't have an answer, you just say I don't know.
So I would say that obviously I don't know the details, right? But I would assume, given my prior understanding of things, that there is some fundamental aspect of the universe that makes things what they are, not consciously, not a mind putting it in place, but that nature at some point in our growing understanding of nature will explain why nature is what it is. And I don't claim to have an answer.
So maybe some kind of theory of everything.
I'm not sure that I have ever fully understood.
Again, you have to go back to what Stephen Hawking wrote in A Brief History of Time. Even though mathematics describes the universe, it's just equations. They don't have any creative power. They have descriptive power. So even if I have a theory of everything that gives me a mathematical equation for the design in the universe that would give me these constants, it still doesn't have the creative power to make the universe. And in Stephen Hawking's words, it was who puts fire into the equations, who brings them the equations alive. And he uses the who, but he doesn't believe in a who, of course. What? He might have said what, actually. And so, again, you're appealing, you talk about God the gaps, you're appealing to atheism of the gaps. You're appealing to something out there that nobody has any idea what it is at all.
No. So let me clarify. I'm not appealing to atheism. I'm appealing to the track record of
naturalism of the gaps.
No,
so
it's not, but it's not natural. Here's the difference, though, that historically, historically, science and its naturalistic approach has been able to explain what theism thought it explained prior.
Now that's a fallacy. That is not true. Not Christian theism. Maybe Roman God theism. But not
hold on. So
theism.
Hold on. The question can be broken down really much simpler. It could just be like, what predictions has theism generated? What predictions has naturalism generated? Well, on one side we have a lot of predictions. On the other side we have zero. I don't see any We'll name like one prediction that was. Okay,
theism
well, what's one prediction?
Theism predicted the universe had a beginning before science found it. There's one.
Okay. Well, so I think that was the next.
Yeah,
but that's not.
Don't you want to ask for two? You want to ask for two?
Yeah, but
I mean, come on.
Well, that just begs the question against somebody who thinks the universe is past infinite.
But so again, there's another problem there, though, and it's. I'm glad you brought this up because I think this is one of my fundamental problems with this perspective. That I think that religion takes certain scientific observations and acts like it was the author of those observations prior to the science. I can take whether it's the Bible, the Quran, or any religious text, and I can interpret it to fit any scientific structure that I want. For you to say that it's that theism or Christian theism predicted that observation. One, I mean, I've had physicists on this channel who don't agree that the universe had a beginning in the way that.
Yeah, I watched some, and their arguments are very flawed. In fact, I'd love to talk about those. I watched one, and I just gagged at it because it was so flawed. I just wish I'd been on the program. It was really
we can definitely arrange that if you like. We could just have like you guys talk because like we don't have relevant expertise in that field in any sense. Well, I know you do in some cases. So that'd be interesting.
Person who brought up the Bordet-Guth, the Lincoln theorem, and that person had no idea what it was, even though it's extremely important and extremely applicable. For another person, they were talking about causation before time. And again, these are theories. It was a theory nobody holds to. And she talked about it as if it was viable. In fact, Cease, you called her on it because it brings up, logical impossibilities. So again, yeah.
Actually, I'm curious on your understanding. I don't know very much about. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Let me say a couple of things. First of all, the purpose of theism is not to make scientific predictions. So I could argue, Mike, that, even that. But here's the point, too. I mean, I'm not arguing for theism in general. I'm arguing for Christianity. And when I read the Bible as to how God works in the universe, he primarily works through the way the universe is designed. The Bible uses active tense, like God feeds the lions. Did the people that write that know how lions were fed? Of course they did. They knew that lions hunted, but they actively use this tense that God feeds the lions. And over again, there's this active tense. So the assumption by some non-theist or non-Christians is that when I can write the mathematical equation, then I have no need for God. That's the God of the gaps. That's not the biblical Christian God. The biblical Christian God mostly works through the laws of nature he created. And so when I write the equation, it means I've written down the method in which God does it. It's like the difference between a car being built by hand in somebody's garage and a car being built by robots. You could look at the car being built by robots and say, there's no human intervention at all. There's no human intelligence behind it, because I can look at the mechanisms and just say it works. But according to the biblical God, that's how he primarily works. So the God that gaps arguments are not arguments made by Christian theists. And you don't point to gaps. You point to what we do know about nature and how well it's designed and how well it works and how well it's orchestrated. And that is the biblical case from nature for God, not necessarily.
Well, we'd have to come to the conclusion. We'd have to come to the conclusion that it was designed. We couldn't have it in the posited in the like unless we're going to generate some prediction. Like we can't just like start there, or else we might just be begging the question. But you might not be doing it that way, so I don't want to accuse that. But there's two things there that interest me. One, I don't think mathematics itself points to ontology, right? Like it's not going to tell. Like, yeah, sure, I don't see an issue that it could some like I don't see a contradiction in like a designer simplicator, right? And then creating the universe and having perfectly applicable notions of mathematics or something, and that's fine. But one with that, like there's the question of that when we actually do assess the ontology in regards to math, we can reduce it down to mental states of agents and then what it refers to, which is like the objects. And so we can have some notion of what in reference to what the mathematics points to, but we can't make some further like metaphysical claim from my perspective about the fact that like God undergirds it, unless we have some type of deductive argument for it or some type of like, so like, presumably I'm looking for like some a priori type of argument or some type of argument that uses facts in the world or, generates some prediction. But when you add the idea that it's not just theism, it's Christian theism, a big talking point that you've had is that it's been reasonable, but now I'm just going to kind of push back that, Dr. Strauss, I don't think that we can even assess what view is reasonable if we've heard nothing about the incarnation, the Trinity, right? All these types of theological implications that are baked into your theory as well. So it's going to seem pretty prude for me to go ahead and assess whether or not the view is reasonable when there's all this stuff that's left, that's not been put on the table.
Well, I'd love to put that on the table and discuss it, but the reason I point out Christian theism is because, if I'm pantheistic and talking about God, then how that God works in nature, or if I'm Eastern religions and how that God works in nature are very different. So I'm limiting it in this context to the Christian idea of how the Christian God works in nature, because that's what we're talking about. Science is the study of the natural world.
But Dr. Strauss, the problem that
I'm happy to talk about the incarnation and all that other stuff too.
My point was just to say it's hard to assess whether it's reasonable or not, given that we don't have all the components or constituent parts. But sorry, go ahead, Cece.
That aside, I mean, on one end, you say that it's not a God of the gaps, but for you, again, to claim that it's designed, to claim that it's fine-tuned with intention, as God as the explanation, I still see that as a gap in the sense that you can say the Bible tells us that God did this, and the other thing, but that is a narrative, that is a story that I think you are expressing. And my thing is, do I have reasons to believe the story is true? Now, I'm with you that I've heard from physicists certain things about the origin of the universe that I think philosophically that do not make sense. I've also had guests on who I respect very much, who, and again, I would love to see a conversation between you guys, because I think that would be very interesting and beneficial for the audience, is who don't buy into the dichotomy that either the universe is eternal or it's created or it's a multiverse. We're looking at, there are other options available there. And I don't think that posing a God that exists outside of reality itself, outside of space and time, that generated this universe, that needs a physical aspect to reality despite being a metaphysical entity, that needs to fine-tune anything despite itself being tuned but not physical, I don't find these moves to be reasonable. I don't, and again, when it comes to what the Bible says, take 100 Christians, all their interpretations of what they think the Bible is saying is going to be very different. And I think that the point you're making is that modern physics is supported by the Bible. The Bible understood some of these mechanics before science really understood them. And this may be that, again, I'm not a physicist. It may be my own ignorance or misunderstanding, but I think quite the opposite is true. Is that the picture that the Bible is painting, the kind of universe that the Bible is painting, is quite in opposition to the universe that modern physics seems to suggest may be the case. Whether it's about the nature of time, the nature of causality, the nature of free will, all these things I don't think are in alignment with the Bible the way that you're saying they are. Maybe, it would be a good, maybe future episode to kind of go into the details of that, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree with all of that, but there was a whole. I was trying to write a few things down because you said quite a few things that are not what I was saying. I mean, so first of all, again, you mentioned something like the supposed fine tuning. Again, the fine tuning is in the physics literature. It's there. I mean, the parameters are in narrow ranges. You have to come up. You don't have to come with explanation. You can say there's the weak anthropic principle. It has to be that way. I mean, but I said it's reasonable, but my perspective is much stronger than that. My perspective is a universe that looks designed. The best explanation is there as a designer. And I would say a universe that looks like it has a beginning of space, time, matter, and energy. The best explanation is a transcendent cause. And I would say, a universe that is described by mathematics as if there's an intelligence behind it. The best explanation is that there is an intelligence behind it. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And so the appeal by those who have other explanations, in my experience, it may not be with you guys, is mostly to ignorance. Well, we don't know for certain that the universe had a beginning. Oh, we don't know for certain that there aren't other universes and we just happen to be in the right one. And what I'm finding, I mean, I've been talking about this for 30 years or so. What I'm finding is that the evidence for the fine tuning, the design, the origin becomes stronger with each passing year. And those who don't like the ramifications are more and more appealing to what we don't know. That to me is agnosticism or atheism of the gaps.
So let me address that real quick, because I think it's an important point you just made. As far as like how I come to believe something, it basically has nothing to do with what I want or don't want to be the case. I mean, if anything, I think if I had certain religious beliefs, my life would probably be easier than it's been. So it's not that I'm in principle opposed to, I don't want God to exist or something like that. That's not the case. What I take issue with is, I think that the observation, the conclusions that you think are follow from some of the observations that even you and I can agree on, I don't think follow. So I'm not denying the fact that there are constants. I just don't think that the narrative used by the theism to explain those constants holds any weight. And that's not to say that I have the answer, but it's not an appeal to ignorance. It's an appeal to humility. It's an appeal to looking at what can we say given the tools that we have, and what is going beyond the scope of the capacity for thought. And so
let me ask you.
Sorry, just real quick.
Let me ask you a question. If we were to limit the conversation to the natural universe. Let's not talk about human problems of evil and suffering. Let's just talk about a universe that can support life. What kind of universe in natural physical laws would point to a designer behind it all, in your opinion?
I think for me to believe in a designer, I would need more than a post hoc explanation. I would need a methodology that can provide what's the word I'm looking for?
Novel predictions.
Novel predictions. So it's not just that here are some observations. How many stories on each perspective can we come up with that might explain generally these observations? I need something far more concrete than that. And so I'm okay with saying that science doesn't do it.
That's not really my question. I mean, my question is, if you were to look at the universe, which is governed by natural law, what kind of universe would point to a designer behind it? If I was to look at the universe governed by natural law,
it seems a little loaded though, because the idea from at least my worldview, and me and Steve have a similar view, is that I can construct a hypothesis on what I would presume to be the case, but that's just a just so story. I'm not no one's interested in just so stories. We're interested in a conjunction of those stories, resulting or generating a novel prediction. So for what I would know it would look like, I'm not in the field to know necessarily right now what would be the case, but that's the point. The point is that we shouldn't conclude that God is the explanation. It's not a point of that I know, or Cease and I know exactly what would look for. It's that people are offering what they take to either be novel predictions or just so stories, and we're assessing to whether or not those claims would live up.
You don't look at a painting and say, what novel prediction does this tell me about the painter? You look at the painting, post the painting, and say, what can I infer about the painter from this painting? You're asking to look at.
That's abductive.
No, it's exactly the same analogy.
That's abductive. We're looking for inductive novel predictions.
You don't get that. You don't
or
get that
deductive.
But you don't get that from the painter's creation. You get that from other things. So we're only talking about the painting. That's what nature is. And you don't get the kinds of predictions Mike is asking for from the painting. That's an absurd request.
Yeah, because it's abductive, and you can only assess what's most likely probable given the data about the painting.
You can learn things. Yeah, but you can deduce that there was a painter. You can deduce characteristics of the painter.
But in virtue of what? In virtue of what? Why can we? In virtue of what?
Because the painting shows things about the person that made it.
But in virtue of what? It's in virtue of a past experience that makes that
past experience.
If I looked at a painting and I didn't know anything about it, I couldn't draw the inference.
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental difference between our position, is that with the painting, I have an experiential history of experience that there are painters who make the painting.
So you're only saying you could believe in God if you have an experience of multitudes of gods.
Not multitudes of gods.
I'm saying that this is a fundamental tension between people that posit this type of theory, because their scope is necessarily limited, but they're using like a scope
at all.
But
there's no you're postulating
if we're using the abductive kind of if we're using like an abductive assessment and looking at a painting or whatever, and then seeing what's most likely probable, well, there is tension, because it's just like miracle claims in the sense that like I don't have a problem saying there could have been miracles, but now let's look at that won't be the point of contention, even though I don't think they exist. The point of contention here is that we're using a scope at which determines what's most likely probable, and in this case, I don't know how we take something that we have no data for, or in the case of miracles, which is definitionally improbable, and then come to some conclusion that's.
Where did miracles come? Where did miracles come from in this conversation?
I was drawing an analogy that there's when you use, or not really analogy, but two different examples under like some abductive umbrella, when you're assessing what's most likely probable, like similarly in the miracles case, it's just an issue that the scope, it's not going to work. An improbable event can't be determined to be most probable by just the definition of what we're talking about. Two, that's the reason why I draw that out. The reason why I draw that saying is that we have like a similar type of issue in the scope of abductive cases, that if all you're going to say is I'm going to look to the past and not generate any novel predictions or inductive predictions in the future, then you've limited your scope. That's not anybody's fault but the person who's limiting their own scope, because what someone could do is say, I'm going to generate novel predictions based on the hypothesis.
No, what I'm saying is that you're asking for something from this realm of evidence that is unreasonable. You wouldn't ask a painting to make novel predictions about future.
But hold on a second.
Because it's static. It's static. The world is not static. The world isn't static. You can go, the painting isn't going to have any inherent cause. Like, you're not going to be able to look at the painting and watch some like cause and effect sequence to generate some expectation, right? Obviously. But in the case of like the analogy you're using, which is why I'm saying that we're not identifying a common property for the analogy, is because when you look at the world, it's not that case, right? There is like this emergent level of causation where we can make predictions and get results and see outcomes. And so that I don't think that the analogy works, because in the case that you would actually be assessing whether or not God is a good hypothesis, it would be under an umbrella of where you can make some type of novel predictions.
Let's not say the painting. Let's say an autonomous car that can drive itself. So again, the autonomous car can drive itself, and you want to make predictions about the designer of the car based on whether or not I can predict what the car will do. That's ridiculous. Telling what the car will do in the future doesn't tell you what the designer was like.
So okay,
it's not just in the future. It's its constituent parts. It's how they operate in conjunction with each other, and then in assessing a past base of data.
But it doesn't make predictions. That's the design that tells you about the designer.
But Dr. Strauss,
you're asking for the nature to make predictions about the creator. That's not how it works.
But Dr. Strauss, the problem is that you can't even make the initial step, because between the painting and the painter, we have a history of empirical data that bridges those two connections. You don't have that same thing when it comes to God and what you call design. That's the problem. It's a flawed analogy because we don't have that set data. And so
you're falling back on the we have only one universe argument, which we haven't even talked about.
No, he's saying that your the conclusion is being used in support of your premises.
Yeah, I'm saying the conclusion doesn't follow from the observations. Real quick, I want to, if you could answer this question.
But the reason you're saying that is because you only have one example. There is no history. That means multiple examples.
I'm saying it because I see no reason to, when I look at the world and the nature of things, I don't see design. I see constants that I don't have the intuition that they have to be set in place.
Physicists see design. You don't have to. Physicists do. Biologists do. Crick says that we have to keep telling ourselves it only looks designed. That means he sees design.
So I don't know about that, because I'm going I went to school initially for biology, and I switched to programming, and I'm hopefully going to be doing bioinformatics at the end of it all. But the departments I've talked to, they don't share that, because I actually talk with a lot of these people at my school, because they have interest in philosophy and religious conversations, whether they're Christian or not. And I've never, they don't say that. So I don't, to me, I would just challenge that.
It's academic suicide in biology to talk about design. So they won't.
It's that that's the whole point. There's no generated expectation that serves that as a justified type of analysis.
Suicide.
Yeah, I can point to.
If they gave the prediction, then it wouldn't be suicide, because it would just be the facts that other people.
I can point to scientific papers. I can point to popular books by scientists that all say that the design looks real and has to be explained by multiverse or God. I mean, you can dismiss that stuff if you want.
Well, no, I'm just confused because now I'm feeling like that's I'm confused because it sounds like a contradiction, because it sounded like you said just a minute ago that nobody would do this because it's academic suicide, but then the next sentence.
In biology, I said.
Okay. Biology versus physics. Okay, that's fair. But yes. Sean Carroll makes like, just like, if we're gonna point out people, there's videos I could point you to where Sean Carroll's someone that says this is not what cosmologists bring to the table. So, which, like, I'm just hearing two people's stories on that. But if I strip it away, it's irrelevant, because I don't really care about the propositional attitudes of other people, because they can be just wrong. What matters is whether or not the actual prediction, if there is a prediction that's being generated, which I'm challenging there is not, and then whether or not we could try to, like, confer that with other people, then that's fine. Like, I care about the peer review process in that case, but I don't care about, like, the propositional attitude or commitment that they have, right? Because that's just irrelevant to the actual evidence that they're conferring with.
Could you answer the question I just posted on the screen, if you could? Begin to Know says,
again, this is a postulation that I don't know is necessarily even true. Causality doesn't necessarily appear to be emergent. Again, causality is, even the fact that there are acausal events, which one of your guests said, is up for debate. I mean,
so let's have that debate. Would you be willing to come back?
Sure.
Because I would love to hear the conversation.
So let me take a step back, because we have been, I won't say heated, but animated. Let's put it that way. And I appreciate this. I learned by this kind of animated discussion. So even though I talked to you initially about how civil things were, I consider this animated discussion still very civil. We are on topic. We aren't calling names. And so I appreciate this level. I grew up with three brothers who are always having this kind of conversation. And so, I appreciate the animated, passionate, but respectful conversation.
I appreciate that. And again, like any of my tone, it's any just about the ideas. Like, I want to always try to make that clear to people that I don't want to attack you, the individual, even if that is some, like, constitutive part of your personality. Like, I get that, and that's an attachment. So I do want to make that distinction, that from my point of view, at least from where I come from, the goal isn't to, like, attack some part of your character or anything like that. It's just the ideas.
Wither asks, how do you explain the flaws in human body design?
First of all, I'd have to ask what flaws. I mean, again, when this is again a common atheist.
We could do like peanuts. Like, peanuts kill people or something like that.
Well, and I have an alarm. Well, I don't know how much. Men have a prostate that can cause problems as you get older and it grows, and it seems a weird design. So any good programmer, which Mike, you say you're going to be, or engineer, knows that when you're designing any system, there are trade-offs, and that you have to ultimately look at the goal of the system and deal with the different trade-offs. And when you say there are designs and flaws in the human body, you're assuming that you understand what the entire goal was of the designer of it. Let me give an example. So I know an example where a junior programmer found what he thought was huge flaws in a senior programmer's program, because there were things that obviously could be done better. And then when he went to the senior programmer and said, why in the world did you do this when there's a much better way, and was explained what the overall purpose was, the trade-offs were made clear.
Okay, but the problem with that,
you have to show me that these design flaws, that there would be a better way to give me the ultimate goal before you call it a flaw. And I don't even know what necessarily the flaws would be.
But
I got one. A 3-year-old eats a peanut and doesn't get to come to the salvation of Jesus, right? Because he dies because of a peanut.
That's not a flaw in human design. Let's be careful.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that God could design a world where a peanut wouldn't kill a 3-year-old and they can come to the salvation of Jesus.
Yeah, but you're talking about a perfect world, and Christian theology says this world is not perfect. It's
I'm just saying I'm just saying in a possible world, if anything, God could have removed peanut allergies,
Yeah, so
and that
Christian
would
theology
just
says
be that would move the world towards a better place
So
Christian theology says we
and a
will
better
someday
design.
live in a world like that. Right.
right. So I guess we've been going for about an hour and 30. I would love to
Oh
bring you
yeah, can we
back.
just real quick before we like tone it down in that sense? There was one thing I wanted to say real quick, and this might not be super relevant, but it was something that you had said, Cease, about the fine tuning on that, and I just wanted to say because this kind of brought it back. The flaws thing, it does seem like there are. I mean, giraffes, they have a nerve that travels like a ridiculous, like a redundant amount of distance. There's a lot of examples we can use, but even if we shelve that, it's like the way that I view it is it seems like if we're going to posit this like great designer, I don't know that it's a good thing if I had a factory that's entire goal is like to produce aluminum sheets. And every 10,000 years it produces like one, but every single day it's producing like 20,000 pounds of anthrax, right? That just like, that seems like a clearly terrible design. And that's what it seems like. Like, even if I don't give the objections to why I don't think it's the case, if I just look at that prima facie, like what God is in this analogy to me is the factory that produces one sheet of aluminum, even though it's its goal and the whole fine-tuned purpose is for sheets of aluminum. But instead, it produces like 20,000 pounds of anthrax until that one sheet every 10,000 years. That seems just such like a terrible design from my point of
And
view.
furthermore, the problem with your answer about the bad design in saying that we're assuming the goal of the creator is now you're appealing to mystery. It's like any argument, any piece of evidence that we can bring to you to point to why the design is a flawed design, why the universe is heading into destruction, why there is cancers, why there is, while most places in the universe are too hot or too cold to inhabit life, why the life that does exist is so deeply flawed, just empirically, observably flawed. If the answer is, well, you're not God, so you don't know any better, and so we should just trust that God knows best, that to me is a kind of crystallization of the dogma a priori, where it's like now you're not operating in the field of comparing and contrasting evidence. It's that you have the story, the fallen world, that complexity points to design, that the conditions must mean that something made it that way, that the universe must have a beginning, that cause and effect must be this particular thing. And I think I have a problem fundamentally with every single one of those argumentations. It's not that I expect any theist to give me the proof of God or the one convincing piece of evidence. I'm okay with the cumulative case for God or for any claim. The problem is that every aspect of the case you're making is based on a narrative that again, and I don't mean to say this in a way that's, I don't mean it to be in a way that's combative. I just don't know how to verbalize it any better. The narrative that you're painting, from my perspective, you lacks the methodology needed to show that it's not imaginary. That complexity has to mean.
So I agree with you in everything you say. So certainly I have answers to the hot, cold universe. We haven't even talked about that. My initial answer for the flaw in humans, there is going to be an aspect of mystery in some answers. And you even alluded to some of the answers. Some of the answers in Christian theology is that God has given humans the ability to make choices, and those choices are often negatively affect the rest of humanity. So don't take my initial response to that question as my overriding answer to these big questions. It's certainly not. Again, the history of, quote, flaws in the human body is interesting. It's the same as the history of things like junk DNA, where at one time we think these don't have purpose, and then we find they do. Junk DNA was supposedly some 90% of DNA that had no purpose until the Encore study, which showed that almost all junk DNA is functional. So now it appears as if most of the DNA is functional, though for years there was this argument that there couldn't be a designer because most DNA was junk. And so we just have to be careful when we throw out arguments that say what we know now says that the tonsils are, flawed and unnecessary, and then we find that they have a purpose. And so, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, but some of these arguments that I hear are really arguments of I can't think of the word but saying, they're throwing up smoke screens in some sense. We don't know how flawed the human body is. And when we have said in the past, this is flawed, this doesn't make sense, we often find later that that's just not the case.
I'm okay with some.
I do want to point out, though, that there is there's contention amongst the ENCODE project. So I just want to throw that out there because, like, I'm just saying that there's a debate. There's a debate to be had on it.
From those who can't. That contention is from those who can't believe that much of the DNA is functional.
Well, they concluded it's like, from my understanding, it's been a while, but from what I understand, it's like 50% of the genome in like virtue of transcription. But I think it was like up to 50% of the non-coding sequences. I got to look more into that myself. But
I haven't looked at it in a while. But my point is, for I don't know, decades, let's say, there was this rhetoric that most DNA was junk and left over from our evolutionary past until we find otherwise. So we need to be careful when we, in our limited understanding of nature, say this shows poor design or this shows such and such, when it may not.
But I think I agree with you. But I think we also need to be careful in our limited perspective to also call things design. Which again, I think the problem that I run into fundamentally is that all of what you said, I don't know why I should believe that it's anything beyond the imaginary. That the narrative you've constructed, that I should believe it captures something that's real out there, as opposed to another story.
But see, that was my question. What would it take from nature, not, miraculous, from a working autonomous car, from nature, a system that seems to work, that would tell you otherwise?
The same kind of empirical basis and capacity for novel predictions that we use to accept other scientific claims. So
but
I would need the same kind of thing.
But these, but we're not talking about scientific claims. We're talking about postulating a different kind of intelligence behind it.
Yeah,
what would it take?
But what reason would I have to believe in anything that doesn't have that scientific basis?
I'm asking you what it would take. So suppose there was a God.
It's unfalsifiable. It could be unfalsifiable because it could just be the case that with any explanation you give, you could just have God behind the curtain. Right?
Okay, so let me clarify my answer.
And that's my problem.
My answer is that I can't believe something that doesn't have that scientific foundation that can separate the imaginary from the actual. And we can look at the constants of the universe. But when you're making that jump from the constants to design, or from the constants to fine-tuning, meaning that the constants were tuned by intelligence, when you're making the jump from, and again, we didn't get to everything. I would love to have you back, but from language to from the universe being intelligible to that pointing to an intelligence. These are all things that I think are not grounded in anything concrete. They're imaginary stories.
But I don't feel like you've answered my question. What I'm asking is, let's take something totally unfamiliar to anything within the human experience, like the universe itself. I mean, we build cars, we make paintings, and you were to come across something that's unfamiliar. What would it take for you to infer that intelligence is the best explanation?
I couldn't make that inference because I couldn't
Right.
understand
So,
what was
so what
experiencing.
I'm hearing is that no evidence from science would ever convince you that there's a designer behind it.
No, that's so.
No.
This is the issue that I'm having is
No.
that the fact that you can produce novel predictions for your theory potentially doesn't mean that I know necessarily what that's going to look like. That's up to you. It's up to whoever's constructing the hypothesis. It's not up to like
Again,
some other scientist.
we're back to the novel
When someone like
predictions.
posits quarks or something
The
the first time,
created
it's not like
object doesn't
you
make
wouldn't
predictions,
you wouldn't ask them, like someone who's not
right?
constructing the
I
hypothesis,
don't
like what they think.
understand this insistence that the created object is supposed to make predictions.
But we use certain structures and certain
Then in
theories.
virtue of what can you determine it to be true? I mean, if it's not in virtue of a
That's
a priori
what I'm
deductive
asking
argument,
you. That's
yeah,
what
but
I'm
that's not the
asking you.
that's to me that
What
just that seems
aspect of a
that's
what
just a
aspect
burden.
of a
That's just a burden shift. Like the fact that like I don't have to. None of us have to know what it would take because it's not our theory. It's your theory.
Yeah.
No,
Well,
I'm taking it outside the realm of God. I'm saying if you came across something that was totally unfamiliar, that was not human-like, was not human creation-like, what would it take
Yeah.
you to convince that it was created by an super intelligence?
I don't think that my answer, I don't think, means that I am closed to scientific evidence. I'm saying I actually think it's quite the opposite. I'm saying that the only thing that would convince me is applying science the way that it's meant to be applied. And I don't think that
or some methodology.
some
Just some
methodology that
method.
can separate the imaginary from the
Science
actual.
isn't science, but Mike keeps using the predictive thing. Science doesn't make predictions of the created object. It makes inferences about the creator that made it. You can't look at a painting
that's
and
perfect.
Predictive.
That's perfect. Then it seems like that. Then someone, because this is the problem I always have, is that like if me and Cease are building a house with a hammer and we're conceding that you could potentially come to knowledge or have a different tool, right? Like a screwdriver or something. It's not like the idea is that if I'm saying from my worldview that what I would like to see are some predictions that are generated, and I've avoided saying novel testable predictions because some people might contest the testable part. That's fine. I just wanted novel predictions. But if someone like you goes, well, hey, Mike, I see your novel predictions hammer, and that's actually not the only way to come to knowledge or to determine this methodology. Well, I can't know what that would be if you've determined that in your hypothesis that there is some methodology, whatever it is. If we've never heard of it, I'm open to it. The problem is there's nothing. This is Cease's whole point. There's no method there that's being applied to go from the imaginary just so story in the head to it being reflective of the reality that we live in. And I don't care if it's a scientific method, if it's an a priori deductive method. I just want an offer of some method.
There is a method.
It just seems kind of strange to ask the person who's inquiring about it what they would expect, because
there is
like
a method.
that's what we're inquiring about in the first place is what is your theory on it. So like if I was inquiring about how you come to the conclusion, like I don't know what help it does me to give you what I would think, because I don't come to the conclusion, obviously.
Wait, you said there is a method. What is the method? What is the method?
The method is inductive. The method is the legal historical method. You look at all the evidence and you say, what is the best hypothesis based on all the evidence? That's a methodology.
Historical is going to be abductive. Inductive is going to generate novel predictions. So then there wouldn't be contention on what I'm saying.
Right. So, in the example of the object, when we're talking about the predictions, it's in what mechanics do we apply to make the object, to result in the object, to understand the way the object functions. Like you can still apply null predictions even in that context. I don't think that it's out of place. But now if you're talking about history, the scope of history in principle deals with things that we have an empirical basis prior to examine. My issue with God or questions of God is that we don't have that. We have the story that we are assuming based on
right. So this is what you keep saying, Cease, and it makes no sense to me. Maybe I'm misunderstanding you. What I'm hearing you say is that without previous experience of God, you won't believe there's a God.
More, not just previous experience of God, but an experience of a way to experience God that would lead itself open to the same kind of mechanics we use with science to believe any other theory. So,
but we don't believe things historically from scientific knowledge. We believe them from historical knowledge.
No, but that is still based on.
Why does it has to be scientific? Why can't
but you don't make abductive assessments into the past where there's no data reference, right? So like because the whole point of an abductive method is what is most likely probably true, and in that case you don't invoke something that's not part of the data set, right? And what's constitutive of a data set? The experience of such datum, right?
History still, when it functioned properly, correlated to the scientific method to some degree. Certainly,
yes, I agree with that.
So I'm not. So I don't think
that's not formal. It depends on what you mean, right? It uses the same kind of reasoning. You have to look at all the data and you have to decide what's the best inference from all the data.
But I think that is precisely, and again, I don't mean any kind of disrespect in phrasing it this way, but I think that is precisely what you're not doing when you're putting the evidence together the way you're doing it, because I don't see the connections. I see what could be the case or what might be reasonable to be the case, but I don't see the connections between, for example, like we said earlier, the constants and the constants having been tuned by
and I just disagree. If the universe looks designed, then the best explanation is it is designed. If the universe looks like it had a transcendent origin, then the best explanation is it did have a transcendent origin. If the Earth looks unique as a home for humans, then then the best explanation is it is unique for a home for humans.
The Earth looks flat, but it's not, right? The Earth looks flat, but it's not. The Earth looks flat, but it's not, right?
No, the Earth doesn't look flat.
Of course it does. Of course, depending on where you are, of course it does. If there's certain areas that are extremely flat, depending on where you're at. But the point being is that something looking some way isn't enough, because that will assume the conclusion. That will
puddle analogy again.
No. I'm not using a puddle analogy. I'm not using a puddle analogy.
It's a red herring. Humans have never thought the Earth was flat. That is a red herring. We can
no. It's not about whether humans. It's not about. I'm not invoking other. What I'm saying is there are people that do, and there are people that say this looks this way, and then they have that conclusion. But what's actually occurring there is they're assuming the conclusion already, right? They're not. It looks like my conclusion, right? But the problem is going to be,
it's nothing like what I'm saying.
But yeah, but if it's well, hold on, if I can finish. When we have some, like if you have some method at which you're determining like this looks most likely that way, well, presumably there's some like corresponding. If you're saying I look at this thing and I look to the past, but that already rules out the God hypothesis in the sense that like there's no data there. So it'd be like if I came up to like a track and we saw like let's say deer tracks or something. I can go, well, what most likely explains it? But if I invoke a unicorn, like that's just not going to work until I have inductive evidence to assess that there's actually a unicorn, right? Like that's going to require.
This is the circular reasoning. This is a circular reasoning you guys keep bringing up. Until I know that there's a God, I know that there's deer. I won't believe that there's
how
a
is
God.
How is my conclusion in my premises?
Because you're saying unless I know that there's a deer already, I won't believe that the tracks are deer. They're unicorn.
No, I'm saying it's not reasonable to make the abductive assessment if that data doesn't exist, because guess what I can do? I can, when we say X is most likely, and I'm using something to fill in X that doesn't have a data set, an inductive data set, then I can choose anything I want that doesn't have an inductive
So
statement.
why is the design of the
And my
universe?
view,
Why does the
but my view is on an epistemic par as your view, right?
Why does the design of the universe not have an inductive data set?
I'm sorry, what was the question? Why doesn't it have an
Why
inductive
does
data
the
set?
design of the universe not have an inductive data set?
That's question begging, because you're just snuck in design there.
Hey guys,
No, because that's what I'm trying to say. I'm saying
Yeah.
I said,
But if
the
you're
design
asking
of the
me on my,
universe
if you're asking,
points
I'm
to a
confused, because if you're
designer,
asking me on,
and you tell me I need an inductive data set, so I asked
yeah.
why that doesn't have an inductive data set.
Oh, no, that's not the question look, your hypothesis generates a prediction, and the question is what is that? It's not up to me to be like, oh, I don't know what it could be, or I don't like, if you have a method and you can determine that it is of design, it's not like, it's like me asking you some question about like, how do you know some other, like, because you take not just a theism, right? You're not just arguing for like vanilla theism or some austere version of God. You're arguing for a specific God. And I could just posit the same question to you about like Allah or some other type of God, and you're just going to be like, well, look, I don't really care about formulating a hypothesis for like a law constitutive of the Quran, right? That's not what I'm saying. Here's the
No, I'm
hypothesis
happy
that
to
I
form a
am generating.
hypothesis. That's not correct. I'm happy to form a hypothesis, and then I'll look at the
Yeah, but we
likelihood of that
could,
hypothesis being true.
sure, but I guess I wouldn't, I don't know that I would, if I was a naturalist, feel any need to ask you the question like what you would expect
but I
from
don't have a
some
problem. I don't
natural
have a
hypothesis,
problem
when
with
what we can do is either just compare our theories and see which one commits more explanatory vices or has a better, like, is more virtuous. But in the case that we do that, you're just giving me the actual methodology to determine it, and then we can compare. But like asking my attitude on it, if I give you something, right, and you go, well, that's not even what I'm saying, that kind of misses the mark. I see what you're saying. Then all you would end up doing is telling me what it is that you do think generates the prediction or whatever. And then it's seeming like we wasted time just to get what I think, when you could just tell me what it is actually proves the case of your story.
I think the question you asked me was a fair one. I have no problem with the question. My issue is that, again, I think for me to believe the design is a good hypothesis, I would need reason to believe that it's designed. No, and I don't think that the observations that we have so far result in that conclusion. We don't have enough data there to bridge that gap.
And I can respect that, and I understand that appeal to authority is not always a reasonable, logical proposal. But I will say that the physicists who study this wrestle with the fact that it looks designed. It looks.
I'm fine with Dr. Strauss. I'm fine with appeals. I'm fine with appeals to.
Right.
Well, I just want to say I'm fine with appeals to consensus. I think that there's like a distinction to be made about like whether or not you appeal to what people think, or to like someone who's not an expert in the field, like a false authority, versus like the consensus. Because the way I look at when people appeal to that is they're appealing to like the data at which they're all conferring to, and that's fine. Like I don't, but the problem is that I don't agree that their attitudes like surrounding that have any implication, because it's just the theory and what's posited in the theory that has the implication.
And real quick before we close out, because I do have to get dinner. I think it's from my understanding, it is inaccurate to say that the majority of people, the consensus in physics, is that the universe appears designed in the context of a theistic framework. People might use the word design, or they might use the word intention, or they might use the word fine-tuned. But the metaphysical, what's what I'm thinking of? The metaphysical.
I agree with you. They're
different. Sorry, I was just going to
When
say
Leonard
that,
Susskind talks about fine tuning and they bring up God, he laughs.
right.
But
So,
why? Why? Because of his presupposition, right? It's
no,
not
I
because
think
of the evidence.
I
Yes,
would say
it
it's the
is.
opposite. I would say the opposite.
No.
Let me put it this way. I can't speak for him, but I'll say I
Right.
can speak for myself. I dismiss the idea of God not because of some presupposition, but because I don't see the connections between the observations and the things that you're saying. That said, I would love to bring you back to converse with a physicist that I bring on here regularly, because I think that would be an interesting conversation for me and for the audience. So I would hope, and I didn't feel like this was particularly heated. I enjoyed the conversation.
No, this to me is the kind of conversation I have with my three brothers all the time.
Sounds good. So yeah, I will set that up.
Oh, so that's interesting. So you guys don't all hold the same view.
Well, no, I mean this kind of animated discussion.
I see.
Yes.
So
I see.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I
will,
appreciate you being a good sport with me in that case, and in seeing that transparently and not assuming like any ill intent there. So I want to reciprocate that. I appreciate that.
I will.
Likewise.
I will keep in touch, and I will. Let me know when you're free next, and we'll set up a conversation about physics and where you might disagree there.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming
Thank you.
on.
Yeah, feel free to drop out whenever you want. We have like a little ending thing where it plays through, so we don't want to make the guest stay any longer. So you feel free to drop out right now whenever you like, and we'll be in contact in emails. Thank you again, Dr. Strauss. And if anybody's interested in more things with Dr. Strauss, if you want to give any information before you leave, I just wanted to plug that there's you can type in Dr. Strauss's name on YouTube, and there's some I got to watch like one of your 5-minute clips that sat down, and then a 30-minute little lesson or lecture type of thing. If you guys want to go watch those are on YouTube, unless Dr. Strauss wants to point you elsewhere. And then
that's fine.
so go ahead.
And I have a blog, michaelgstrauss.com. I haven't updated it in a year. I haven't added anything to my YouTube channel in a year, but those things are out there. Thanks, you guys.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Yeah, have a good one. And anybody in the audience, if you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/axioms on trial. And we greatly appreciate that. It is not required. You can be a lifetime supporter. You don't even have to click the like or subscribe button, but we ask you to please do so to help us and help push this to other people. There are people out there that may not be into these topics at all. We maybe want to bridge them to the community of these conversations, or to philosophy, science, or anything else related to these topics. So yeah, please share this, subscribe, but not required. Cease, you have anything that you want to say before we go out? I know you got to roll out. I got to roll out because I'm hungry as shit. So
no, just what was I going to say? I'm probably going to do a show at some point. I don't know if you want to do it with me on the Roe versus
do a show
Wade.
with you.
The Roe versus Wade situation.
Yeah,
we had mentioned a few clips that we wanted to do a breakdown.
I have a guest that we could bring on for that. That would be just like amazing content.
Perfect. So
yeah, student Dr. Ben, if you're watching.
So yeah, just let me know when you want to do that, and we'll do another episode really soon. We're almost at 100. 5 more, and we'll be at 100. So
technically, we're at 100. We're at 100 videos with the clips. So congratulations to first 100 videos, but we don't make that official until we have 100 streams. And actually, that'll be 99 because the first one I don't think was streamed. I think it was recorded and uploaded, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't remember. So I'll go back and look. So we might have 2 100 episodes. One with a real 100 streams and the other of actual 100 episodes. But anyway, guys, let's let Cease get going. Let myself get going.
Thanks as always, everybody coming in.
I was going to give a shout out to Kat and say, please rewind it and watch it if you are interested. It was a good conversation. A little heated, not really heated, but just a little tiny, little flame. So it's interesting.
I mean, like it's just like as a quick summary, like I appreciate the fact that he came on here, and I do hope that he'll come
Of
back
course.
to talk with David. But I just don't understand how he makes the connections he does. Like I don't get how he goes from constants to design, from being able to understand the universe to there being an intelligence behind the universe. These are all metaphysical convictions that he didn't offer any reason to accept, other than just saying it doesn't make sense that it could be otherwise. That's what I got from the conversation, and yeah, I don't know, but
well, we will have two. We won't have just one smiling face on. We'll have two eventually. I'm getting my laptop charger in the mail, so we'll be back to normal. Pin on it broke, so I'm a little screwed on there, but it's coming in and it'll be all good. Shout out to Theo, Witter, Cat, CP. I saw Ruckster in there earlier, so shout out to everybody that came in and supported. We really appreciate it. We love you immensely. So without anybody that cares, I mean, we still do the show, but we wouldn't be able to I wouldn't be able to do this. I wouldn't be able to talk to anybody. So
that's how I feel. I feel like his conclusion wasn't based on evidence. The metaphysical convictions he had were independent of the observations that we can have. That's the problem that I had with what he was talking about. So
we'll I think a good episode in the future, if we don't do it the next time, since we have a topic, we can kind of review the conversation in some way, or at least I can try to clip together certain parts and we can go over them or something like that. But
sure.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Cease, it looks like I'm going to be able to get the countdown or stream ending set up, so I'm all good.
If you want me to.
You take it away, baby. We appreciate you. We are Axioms on Trial. Everybody stay safe. We love you. Peace out.
See you next time.